Into chapter 5.
I don't know how far we got into it.
Okay.
But when I was reading chapter 5, I said, we already talked about most of this.
Okay. All right. We'll pick up, but chapter 6 is the real fun one. We're getting into, I mean, not fun, but it's real interesting. So we'll get into that. I tell you what, today has, while Bob is getting that all squared away, I'll tell you, today has been a day. So I get to church this morning, and the preschool is going to take a field trip today. And so I said, well, you know what? I need to go get some gas in the church bus, because we used it last week for the preschool, we used it the week before for the preschool, and we used it last week to go see David Jeremiah. And I don't think anybody put gas in. So I said, I'll run and get some gas. So I ran and got the van, got the bus, went to the gas station, got the gas, brought it back up here, and parked it so that the kids could get on, handed them the keys, and the bus wasn't cranking. And I said, well, it wasn't even turning over, and I'm not a mechanic, but I said, it doesn't even sound right. But I pulled my truck around, got the jumper cables out, didn't manage to kill myself or anybody else in the process, and tried to jump it off, but nothing. So we had to scramble, get parents and teachers to drive and get all the permissions together to take the children to the pumpkin patch. And so that was one thing. Turns out the starter was shot in the thing. But I will tell you this, Danny Smith, Danny does our work, and I hate to see him retiring, but Danny came over and he fixed the starter and donated it to the church. So if y'all get a chance to tell Danny thank you, tell Danny thank you, because that was several $100s of work. So we still had some children in the church this morning. Lynn was one of the people who had to go with the kids this morning. So I'm in my office, I'm doing some of this, and I said, I need to be really focused, because we're getting into the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and all this. So I lit my little censer and had a little frankincense going on, and this, I'm just enjoying being smart from smelling the frankincense. And a little bit later, Darla, our business manager, starts beating on my outside door. And she's on the phone. I open the door. I said, what's wrong? She said, you got to get out of the building. There's a fire. I said, there's a fire? Really? And I said, where? She said, must be down there, because all the kids in the preschool are outside and it's raining. And they're all outside and everybody. And I said, I think there's a fire. She said, you can't hear it, because there's an alarm down here that says, like, get out of the building. And it keeps going over and over again. And it's wah, 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 evacuate the building and all this. So you can't hear it in my office. My office is like cinder blocks, and so you cannot hear it down there. And I looked, and there was a light blinking up in the, and I thought it was like this, and I thought it was a light going out, but it was a light that said fire, and it kept blinking. And I said, well, that's probably why that thing was going off. I said, I thought it was one of the other ones. And then Darla looked around and she said, what's all this? I said, incense. So as it turns out, that's what it was. So all the kids got wet because of frankincense today.
No, I think it was because of mine.
Yeah, because of mine, that's right. So anyway, so it has been a day. And then I didn't finish this. I had to go to Greenville. And then I remembered while I was in Greenville that tonight was the chili cook-off, and I promised to make chili. So I had to run back home, make chili, bring it to the church, spill some of it in the car, and then finish this, and then the copy machine. So we'll get there. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day and all your blessings, and thank you, Lord, for the ability to laugh and to laugh at ourselves, and thank you for all the kindness that people still have, that you allow us to see in the world. And thank you for all your blessings. Thank you for this group here tonight, and help us as we study to be faithful to you, to be faithful to your word, and to be attentive as you speak your word to us in the name of Jesus and through him who is the Word made flesh. Amen.
Right. I have one of last week's copies because Gary got us the two we missed before that, but he wasn't here last.
I'll get it to you.
Okay.
I don't actually, Jane, I think this is last week, pretty much last week's and this week's, but I'll double check and make sure. So, just kind of picking up since I think we got into Revelation 5, and I have some questions that really is a great time to ask them now because I included them in here. And they're questions based on Revelation 4 and 5, because Revelation 4 and 5, remember, is a glimpse of heaven. And while there's all sorts of stuff in heaven that we're allowed to see through the eyes of John, one of the primary things, if not the primary thing that we are allowed to catch a vision of, is the idea that worship is, y'all got one? Worship is going on in heaven. But let me ask you a question before we get into the worship thing. Tonight I want to talk a little bit, and then I want to get into chapter 6. I will tell you up front, we're not going to go far in chapter 6, and that's intentional because it is we go from this level of symbolism and intensity to this level of all of this. So we're not going to be able to do it all. But I want to ask you some questions. Not everybody has to answer. Somebody who feels like it, if you don't mind. What do you think is the most common misconception that people have about heaven? And if you look, these questions are they're in there. After chapter 4 is broken down, the questions come right after. Question, Revelation 4 and 5 give us a brief vision of heaven. So what do you think is the most common misconception people have about heaven? Anybody want to?
Streets of gold.
What?
Streets of gold.
Streets of gold? Well, that's not actually a misconception. They're there. Yep. So, Mark.
I think the biggest misconception is I think people think it's just going to be one gigantic party. You want to golf every day, fish every day, you just do that forever. And you don't have to do anything else but whatever makes you happy and whatever you've always wanted to do, but then you get that time to do it.
So heaven, I think you're saying, is a very me-centered, my pleasure eternity.
And I'm going to do what I want to do, and you can do what you want to do, and everybody else can do everything they want to do, and we're not worried about anything else, and I think that's not right.
All right? And I think and the reason for asking these questions, as we move forward now, we're going to see the answers to those questions, and we're going to get them. Anybody else want to add to anything Mark said or say something else? Do you have a personal, maybe you don't want to answer that, but do you have your own idea of heaven?
No, and Bobby, he's up there straightening it up.
Straighten it up. Yeah.
He's going around here and straightening up the shoes. I said, "Rob, you don't work here."
Yeah.
That's what he's doing.
Giving people, yeah, that's right. All right, Revelation 4 and 5 also give us glimpses of worship in heaven. So what does it mean to you to worship God? Now this is an important question. I do want to spend a little time in this particular area in a minute. What does it mean to worship God? Anybody?
To honor God.
To honor God.
Give God credit for all of His creation and all of His goodness.
Okay.
Reverence.
Reverence. Okay.
And to turn to, that's what I do.
Okay.
Every night, I
Okay.
thank God I've got you, God. I've got some stuff to give you.
There you go. Yeah.
He's probably saying, but I don't think. It's something
Yeah. Worship, our word worship comes from the English word worthy, which comes from the Greek word axios. But to worship is to be worthy of something, to be worthy of esteem and honor and praise and all of that. The notion of worship is, I think, the misconception of worship in the modern, and I won't say American, I would just say the modern Christian mind, is that worship is something we go to. Worship is a service we attend. Worship is something that takes place in a church building or at some other kind of event. But worship, technically, for the Christian, is an all of life activity. Now, it is described and prescribed in the Bible in very definite ways, but we're also told in Old and New Testament that our worship is bound up with how we live to God and for God and in the sight of God. One of my favorite Latin terms that was a big term, a big phrase during the Reformation is coram Deo. And it means, essentially it means God sees you, but it means we do this in the sight of God. So our worship is all that we do. We forget, we kind of think that, okay, right now, pretend that you're seeing me, this is Sunday. You're God and I'm me worshiping. I'm in church. You can see me because it's Sunday. The rest of the week, we think that we're here and God is there and God can't see us. And so we've gone to worship on Sunday for an hour and that's it. But that's not worship. I mean, that is participating in a worship service, but all of life, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. This is the worship that is due to God. That's what Paul says. So when we see that, when we understand that, what do we learn about worship from these chapters? I think that we learn from the chapters 4 and 5 is that God is so great that he deserves our worship. That he's so great that even the saints and angels that surround him in heaven are still praising him for the same reason Miss Janet is praising him. Because he's good and he's great and he's loving and he's kind and he hears us and he's beneficent and all these kind of things. And even though they've attained the prize, they're still doing it because that's just who God is. Now, I'll do this because it's kind of easier, I think, for me to get to, not to say it's not for you, but let me just read you a couple of passages of Scripture, and then I want to ask you a question. So I'm going to ask, after reading, as we have, Revelation 4 and 5, and then some of these passages that I'm going to read to you, I want to ask you a question. Now listen to this. This is from Exodus 15:1. Moses and the people of Israel sang a song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. And then it goes on, that song of Moses goes on to recount the Exodus story. And then we go to the 96th Psalm. Psalm 96 and verse, what? Oh, the whole 96th Psalm. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord. Bless his name. Tell out his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among the people. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. And then, of course, we have the 100th Psalm. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into, glad I can remember it because I can't find it. Come into his presence with what? Singing. Know that the Lord, he is God, and all of that. Then the 104th Psalm says, much the same thing. 104 verse 33 says, I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. I could continue, but all of these things speak of singing to the Lord. So, with that in mind, this is an important thing, because revelation in any real Bible study is not about just helping you understand a passage or a book or a chapter that you're reading, but trying to get you to also say, how does this apply to my life as a Christian? So here's an application part tonight, just a little bit. So understanding that chapters 4 and 5 talk to us about worship, and that worship is bound up in singing the praises of God. Now I want you to be honest. What part does individual and congregational singing play in your life? What part does it play in your church? It may not be a question we want to answer out loud, but it's a question that I think we should ask of ourselves. We are so conscious of whether or not we think we can sing that often we don't sing. I do think that singing is one of the things that marked the Protestant faith. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Anybody else need one? Congregations, it's interesting. The Bible speaks, if you go back to Colossians, Ephesians, and all that, the Bible speaks how the early church sang. Paul told them to sing praises and hymns and all of this stuff. And the early church sang, and a lot of times they would sing the Psalms. I mean, that's what they sang mostly. They would also sing the creeds and some other things as they sang. Singing just fell out of, just fell out. There was chanting that the churches did for the next several, 100 years and whatnot, but there was no real sense of a congregational song like the Bible said. Luther, Calvin, and the Reformers reintroduced singing when they reintroduced their common languages. They reintroduced them. So Sunday is October 30th. The Reformation happened on October 31st, 1517. So Sunday is Reformation Sunday. And like every good Protestant, we will be singing Luther's great hymn, and maybe my favorite, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. It is one of the most powerful, but I'm also preaching on the devil, and it mentions the devil. But nevertheless, we began singing. The Protestants were known as people who sang. Not only people who sang, we sang our theology. Methodists took it one step further. Charles Wesley wrote over 6,000 hymns. If you want to know what Methodists really believe, read Wesley. Don't read anything else. Go read a hymn that Charles Wesley wrote, and you will find that what John and Charles believed is a far cry in some cases from what folks believe today. But we sang, in fact, we were called the Singing Methodists, but we sang our theology. We sang our doctrine. It was catechesis. We taught our children by singing. Most of you, even if you didn't grow up Presbyterian or Lutheran or in some other denomination that used a catechism, I bet you $1 to a donut, you know theological terms and doctrines from singing the hymns that you grew up with. You can tell about grace because you sang Amazing Grace. You can talk about being a new creation because you sang Love Divine, All Love's Excelling. You can talk about being assured of forgiveness and salvation because you sang Blessed Assurance and those kind of things. So you know doctrine. You know that, another of my favorite songs, Praise to the Lord the Almighty. You know that everything with life and breath should praise the Lord, as it says in there. And so all of these things we know through singing. Singing is a lost, or something that's being lost in the church today. Congregations don't largely sing much anymore. congregations want to be sung to. John Wesley said, and if you Sunday morning, if you're in church, if you're in the traditional service, open it up, look at Wesley's directions for singing. He wrote directions. This man he never found a rule that he could write about that he didn't write about. So he wrote directions for singing, and one of them is never be more afraid of your voice now when you're singing the praises of God as you were when you sung the songs of Satan. And I like that, which means basically, not that Garth Brooks is Satan, but if you're jamming in the car singing, I got friends in low places, then you ought to sing, then I got friends in high places when we sing with all the saints in glory on Sunday morning, you know? So don't be afraid to sing. And singing should make a comeback because Revelation tells us that singing is something important. There's some other stuff. I want you to look over that. A little bit later. Let me see what time it is. I want really to get to, I think basically we looked at chapter 5. Chapter 5 is, the continuum of the glimpse into heaven. Chapter 4 talked about God the Father. Chapter 5 talks about God the Son. I know that we finished, I talked about Jesus and John was weeping and Jesus and Lazarus. And I know we talked a little bit about angels and these living beings. So I want you to look, let's do this. Let's go down to chapter 5, verse 7. This is when the story changes. If you ever get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, like I get up a little bit before 5, and I told you this before, but I can tell you it's like clockwork. I watch Highway Patrol with Roderick Crawford at 5 o'clock, and it is, I have to do it. My day is not complete if I don't watch Highway Patrol. Hey, Miss Grace. And how are you? Let me show you where we are. Got lipstick? Well, face don't care. So,
I'm sorry.
well, where's it at? There it is. That's it, right there. So, at 5 o'clock, you go through the story. It sets the story up. And it's just kind of, okay, this is ho hum. All of them are sort of set up. But at 17 minutes after 5, and this is just the way that they do their commercials, but 17 after 5, there's a commercial come on. It's the same one almost every day. It's this bathtub jacuzzi thing by Christina. She was on the home at HGTV. It was she and her husband. They got a divorce. But anyway, it comes on like clockwork 17 minutes after 5. I know at that point that the good part of the story is going to come on afterwards, because that's when Broderick is going to shoot the guy and catch the criminal. Happens every week, every day. This is the same thing. This is the commercial. The rest of it was the commercial before the big stuff. Jesus is much better than Broderick Crawford, but here we go. So Jesus went, this is verse 7, and took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. Now, him who is seated on the throne, obviously God the Father, the throne is the representation of all of God's sovereignty. So you cannot take something from the sovereign being unless you are the sovereign being. So this is an interesting note that one part of the Trinity is doing this for another part of the Trinity. But it is the great culminating act of human history. It's the principal act of the second coming in judgment. This is the beginning of the end. This is where it starts, where Jesus will come back to judge the quick and the dead. Paradise will be regained, the ungodly will be punished, and all of those kind of things. When he had taken the scroll, everything fell down before the Lamb, holding a harp, golden bowls full of incense, which were the prayers of the saints. Now, I did mention this last week because I did bring the fire alarm incense in here, but I think it's interesting. There's a couple things I want to point out. Harps were played at feasts and celebrations. Now, there is a caricature of heaven, people holding the harp, playing harps on the cloud. Don't worry about a cloud, but the harp is very important because it meant that something magnificent, a feast, a great imperial celebration was about to happen. And music will fill the courts of heaven because of this. And then the elders held a golden bowl of incense. This reminds us of the altar of incense in the temple. And the priests burned the incense to. It was as though the prayers were rising. The smoke from the incense rose to heaven, and it's why the church still uses incense as reminiscent of prayers, and it's a reminder, a call to prayer. But here is an interesting thing that I want to pass over to you. It begs the question: the golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. I'm going to mention this, and then we're going to duck out of it and run to the next chapter in a minute, but we'll come back to it because it's there too. It begs the question: do the sainted dead, the righteous departed, A, have knowledge of things taking place on earth? B, do they intercede and pray for people on earth? Well, the scriptures seem to indicate that they do. Now, Jesus, Romans 8:34 says, is at the right hand of God, and he is interceding for us. We know that. Jesus is praying for you. So here's one thing to again, kind of go with what was said by Miss Janet just a minute ago. Even if you feel like you're alone in the world, Jesus is praying for you. I know that's hard to wrap your head around. It's hard for me to wrap my head around sometimes because sometimes you feel abandoned. But when you know that Jesus himself is praying for you by name at the throne of God the Father, you can pretty much make it through a dark night. But here's something else. The saints pray for us, those who are already in heaven. Now, so I've said it this well. Let me go back to Luke 16 for a minute. You remember in Luke 16, let me just turn to it. Luke 16 is that great story that is kind of confusing if you're not careful, because let me find it. Rich man and Lazarus. There was a rich man who was clothed. This is Luke 16:19. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, not Jesus' friend Lazarus, but anyway, Lazarus covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. He didn't want to eat at the table. He didn't want a plate full of chili like we had tonight. He just wanted something that fell in the floor. That's how hungry and how humble he was. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. That's a fancy way of saying paradise, to the land of the sainted dead, the intermediate state. He's not quite in heaven, but he's where Jesus said, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." It's like the front porch of heaven. Just hold on, we can talk about that at another time. The rich man died and was buried, and he was in Hades. Hades is not the good place. Hades is the front porch of hell. He was being in torment. He lifted his eyes up, and he saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. So here's a fascinating thing. The man in hell can see the man in heaven. Now, if that don't make hell hell, I don't know what does. Think about that. It's bad enough that you're on fire, but you got to see everybody else who's not. Or who's doing like Mark and playing golf all day long, you know. You're down there burning up and they're playing, you know, Augusta National. So he's in torment. He looks up, sees them, and he calls out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. Now, Jesus did not tell stories that did not have meaning and truth and significance. So here's something that we need to be mindful. But Abraham said, Child, remember, you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. Besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them. So he also has knowledge of earth, that he may warn them so that they won't come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have the law and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but someone goes from the dead, they will repent. And Abraham said, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, then they also won't listen to anybody if they rise from the dead. See, that's a ton of different messages in there. They didn't listen to Moses and the prophets. They're certainly not going to listen to Jesus. But also there's this great mystery about the ability of the people who are yet in the intermediate state to have knowledge and access and even intercede. This guy's in hell, and he was, in a way, trying to intercede for his family. He didn't want them to end up like him. Stopping point, just for a minute, for a preaching moment. Friends, don't wait till we get to hell until we realize we don't want our families to go to hell. Let's do something about that now, because then, as you see, it's too late. For most Protestants, this seems like contrary to what we've been brought up. I brought up Reformation Sunday. We have no concept of this, really, because it's been conveniently avoided. What Protestants are opposed to is prayers to the saints. The practice that the Catholics of the Reformation era did, so that, if you wanted, it's still kind of something today, but like if you wanted to sell your house, I think it's still a practice, and I think it's Joseph, that you go and bury a statue of St. Joseph beside your house in your yard, and then it'll sell. I'm not sure that Century 21 does good business that way, but if they do, there might be some money in it. I don't know. But that was one of those things. St. Jude, the Home for Children, it's St. Jude was not just a patron of children, but a patron of lost causes. Hence why Danny Thomas said, this is great because these children don't have a chance if we can't do anything for them. It's a wonderful thing. I'm not knocking St. Jude or anything like that. But the Protestant tradition is not, we don't pray to saints for help. But there's nothing in our tradition, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, whatever, that says they don't pray for us, because the Bible does. And either we will believe the Bible or not. Here's the thing. Let me just say this. Who had the most saintly grandmother in the room? Don't be ashamed. Raise your hand. All right, Jane. Jane, I imagine your grandmother prayed for you every day of her life, didn't she?
And all of her other grandchildren.
And all of her other grandchildren and everything else. So why do you think, if your grandmother prayed for you every day of her life on this earth, and now she is this close to Jesus in heaven, why, if she can have access to him and can talk to him face to face, why is she not praying for you now?
Well, she is.
There you go. You're right. But see, this is the point.
And my children, and my grandchildren.
And everybody else. This is the point that I'm making. I'm not trying to introduce some new crazy thing. I'm just trying to help everybody see. We don't just have Jesus interceding for us, but grandma, granddaddy, whoever else, husbands, wives, who are with the Lord, they have greater access and communion with God now than we do. And if they prayed for us on earth, Lord knows they're praying for us now, because they want us to be with them. Now let's jump. Let's jump. All the way over to chapter 6. So Jesus has started, he's taken the scroll. The scroll is the deed of creation. He's taken it. He is sovereign. He's in control. And we have this little side effect over here. The saints are praying. Now I watched when the Lamb, Jesus, opened one of the 7 seals. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a loud voice like thunder. I got to get me one that y'all are looking on, because mine is the one I wrote in handwriting, and I've discovered that I can't read my own writing. First thing to understand is that only Jesus is worthy to open the scroll. It's the title deed of creation. He breaks the seals that secure it, and each seal unleashes a new demonstration of God's judgment on the earth. It marks the beginning of God's wrath and judgment on sinful humanity as he begins to take back what Satan has stolen from him. Now, what's interesting is I checked with about 16 different translations of the scriptures in English, and all but 2 used the word come when it said, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, come. And I don't know why that is still rendered in that word, because the better meaning, because this is one of those strange words. It means come, as in come here, or go, as in go forth. This is actually the better word. It means go forth. It's essentially the sending and unleashing of the horsemen to fulfill their God-given mission. Now, here is a mind-blowing concept. If you didn't think that the praying business of the saints in heaven was mind-blowing, think about this. That God uses evil to do his work in the world. In other words, he works through these evil things. He works. There's nothing the devil can do that God does not allow him to do. There's nothing that these 4 horsemen can do that God is not commanding them to do. God uses anything and everything that he has created to do his purpose in the world. It is mind-blowing. In this case, he uses the 4 horsemen to exact his righteous judgment. God is sovereign, though. He's in total control of everything, and everything must obey him in this regard. So he sends these horsemen to bring judgment. This brings up some questions. Have you ever considered how God uses evil to do his will in the world? How he uses people who are not Christian or inherently evil to do his will? Can you think of an example? Don't necessarily give it, but can you think of an example? Could it be that God is doing that right now? Judging by way of this method. Judging this nation, judging the world, judging our society, judging our homes, even judging our churches or his church. Right now, through anything that might be going on in any of them. There's plenty enough evil that goes on in this nation. And sometimes it seems to have the upper hand. A lot of people on one side of the fence, I don't think they're wrong, will say, well, if we can just have great revival in the land, if we can just get back, and if this nation, if my people who call by my name will repent and confess their sins and all this, blah, 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 I will hear them and all of this. I don't disagree with that. But the people on this side say, you know what? We should have been doing that a long time ago, because it might be that God is just punishing us now and we're being judged. I don't disagree with that either. And God's judgment is coming through the wickedness that we see in the world. And that we have to protect our children and our grandchildren from. And that even is inside the church. So the first 4 seals unleash the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And I looked and behold a white horse. White is the color of purity and peace. The rider of the first horse will bring about a time of peace, but it will be a false peace. It will also be a false religion. Purity. It's ushered in by false teaching, false messiahs, false doctrine. This will culminate with the individual known as the Antichrist. This, friends, is nothing more than deception on the grand scale. Now, there are many theories about who the Antichrist is. And, you know, there's all this, there's a thing called gematria, and it's the correlation of letters to numerals. You know, in Hebrew, for instance, and in Greek, the letters corresponded with numbers. So an A was 1, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you added up the numbers of somebody's name, like Emperor Nero equaled 666. So you can say, oh, well, Nero was the Antichrist. Well, that works until you get to Winston Churchill, whose name also works. So does Ronald Wilson Reagan. I think it was Nikita Khrushchev, whose name. But it all gets thrown to pot for sure when Winnie the Pooh is 666. So we're not, you know, there are some who try and they spend their time in gematria and they try to get, okay, this is a person that he's going to be here and he's going to come out of here and he's blah, 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 blah. And it may well be. I don't believe we'll know who it is until it's too late. But I do think, personally, that it's a person. But it's presented in such a way that it could also be a world concept. That no one person except Satan behind the scenes is in charge of. I think we're seeing some of this kind of stuff go on today. Not that this is what we're experiencing today, but there's so much that seems to be so sinister and clandestine and secretive and all this kind of stuff that goes on, and you hear all this stuff. And not that that's what it is, but I'm just saying it. I think it's a person at some point in history, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Nonetheless, whatever this is deception on a grand scale. It's mimicking the peace and purity of Jesus and his righteousness and his holiness in order to seduce and deceive the world into a false peace so that the world can be dominated by him. Horses. He sat on a horse. Now, horses in the Bible, all the way up to the 19th century, were the primary war machine on land. Horses were seen for over 2,000 years as more of weapons of war than as agricultural or transportation assets. All that stuff was done by donkeys and camels and cattle. But now here's another indication. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Notice he had a bow, but he didn't have any arrows. You know, if you ever watch Gunsmoke like I do, I don't know if there's a new TV show that I've watched in years. They're bad, number one, and my children can't watch them, so I don't watch them. I'd rather see them, you know, shoot up covered wagons and everything else than shoot up drugs. So, but imagine all the Indians that Matt Dillon might face if they all had just bows. Festus could beat them all. You don't have a bow without an arrow unless something is up. Well, here's the thing. The bow is a symbol of war, but without arrows it's useless. And this indicates that his power is a false power. His peace is a false peace. But see, here's where slippery, sneaky, seductive, and it's why we can tell that the devil is behind it, because his victory will be bloodless. It will be won by lies and deception, sensitization. You know what sensitization is? It's when, the frog in the kettle. You put the frog in the kettle, turn the heat up slowly, the frog gets so accustomed to it that pretty soon you have frog soup. This is where we are now. When you see a commercial that has, I won't even name something because, you could pick any commercial out there. And 10 years ago, you wouldn't have thought of seeing that commercial on TV. Now you see the commercial on TV, and not only do you see it on TV, you have to turn the TV now from certain channels. Even TV Land has these things on it. And even Nickelodeon has these things on it. So you have to censor the commercials that your children are watching. That's sensitization, and it's intentional. Seduction, misinformation, and confusion. If we don't live in the world of misinformation and confusion now, then we never will. But it's going to get worse. The crown is the Stephanos crown. It's not a diadem. A diadem is a royal crown. It's the crown that Jesus has. A Stephanos is a crown that you win. It's an athletic crown or something like that. It indicates that he has won a victory, maybe even an election. But he's become the world's leader, either by election or popular opinion. Now, we'll say this. When it says he who sat on it, it doesn't necessarily mean a person as in an individual, except maybe here in the first horse. But rather it indicates forces and things that happen, the forces of opposition to Christ and his church. It's possible that the rider of the white horse is the Antichrist. What is certain, however, is that from this rider, this force, the Antichrist will come because the way has been prepared for him. If the white horse, rider on the white horse is not the Antichrist, then he is John the Baptist kind of person to the Antichrist. He's preparing the way. Does that make sense? Okay. Another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Red is pyros. It means fiery, bloody red. It speaks of war, bloodshed that the rider will bring to the world. These are the beginnings of the birth pangs of God's wrath. You can see that in Matthew 24:7. This sword is not a long sword, but rather a short, dagger-like sword that assassins use. It's the kind of sword, I'll give you exactly the sword. It was the one that Brutus used when he assassinated Julius Caesar. It is a symbol, pardon the misspelled word, of cruelty, viciousness, massacre, and slaughter. Again, these were the swords, these were the weapons of assassins. Other people who were in the military and in the police and all this, they didn't carry these things. These were the switchblades of the day. Let's put it that way. This war, by the way, may not be a World War III scenario. If you grew up in the 70s, you saw all of these end times predictions and Hal Lindsey stuff, the late great planet Earth and all this. And there was all this stuff of nuclear holocaust. And then we were in the middle of the Cold War. We still had nuclear drills and all these kind of things and all that. But as we've moved past that, this may not be a World War III kind of scenario like that. It could be a COVID-like scenario. That's Hal Lindsey saying, "Don't take my name in vain" on your show. It could be a war that rages around the world in a non-conventional way. I mean, think about this. Did we not see people during the COVID pandemic? Did we not see people turn on each other all around the world and are still turning on each other today? People, vaccine, not vaccine, mask, not mask, booster, not booster, etc., etc., etc. Warlike is the best way to describe some of that. And also, it's pretty clear that COVID-19 came from a lab in China. Now the question that remains is, was it an accident? Was it a mistake? Or was it an intentional act of biological war? Regardless of the answer to the question, the prospect increases each day that something far worse could yet happen. I don't know if you saw the news, but some of our labs are working on stuff that's way worse than COVID.
Boston University,
Yeah, Boston University.
80% death rate.
80% death rate. Well, Jane, since Jane brought it up, I will tell you this. You know who owns Boston University? The United Methodist Church. That's where part of your apportionments are going to the 80% death rate biological weapon. Anyway, let me get off of that horse for a minute. Pardon the horse. When he opened the third seal, I heard a third living creature say, "Come," or "Go forth." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and the rider had a pair of scales in his hand. I heard what seemed to be like a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine." I'm going to go only through the fourth horse, okay? We're going to get the 4 riders. So, black is the symbol of famine. The Great World War will destroy the food supply. But now here's the question. Will it be because of crop destruction, because of conventional warfare? I don't necessarily think so. You remember World War I devastated the crops and the agricultural fields of Europe just because the mechanisms of war were terrible and were not the kind of things. World War II didn't help it any better, but I don't think it was worse on the agricultural thing than World War I was. But will it be due to nuclear fallout, or what's called the nuclear winter, when the nuclear haze around the planet is so great that the temperatures become too low for things to grow? Or will it be due to biochemical poisoning of the land and the water sources? We don't know, but no matter what, we can be sure that global hunger and food scarcity is introduced here. By the way, this is the natural progression of things. A dictator comes to power, promising the world, think Castro, and then pretty soon it turns out not to be what he promised. And the only way to keep things going is by oppression, war, bloodshed. And then pretty soon the whole mechanism falls apart, and you got famine and disease and death. This is a natural progression of the way it works in the world that God is showing us here, and how punishment will be meted out. But anyway, let's go back. So global hunger, food scarcity. With that, prices increase, and so does corruption. I mean, my goodness. We've seen, South Carolina sees it all the time because of hurricanes, but we saw it also in COVID, price gouging for gas and other necessities, water and other things. When prices increase and supply goes down, corruption goes up. The scales, there's the scales business, a pair of scales in his hand. The scales of justice will be broken. So will the scales of kindness and decency and human compassion and fairness. People will take advantage of other people when the economic scales are broken, and they will cheat them blind. You know, that's unfortunate, but it's human nature. Everything, this is telling us, will be out of balance. Economies and currencies will be destabilized, and they will crash. Y'all, did you ever think when you, seriously, when you read the Bible, you know, I think it was Spurgeon who said that the Bible was as current as today's newspaper. And I think if you look at this, you can tell it is. Economies and currencies will be destabilized and crash. Rationing, shortages, food lines, riots, starvation, crime, and chaos will ensue. I mean, if you think about Weimar Republic Germany, and then into Nazi Germany, particularly Weimar Republic Germany, and other places when they had so many post-World War I, pre-World War II, food shortages, and there was all this rationing. And then during World War II, we had all these things that were rationed over here in the United States. I don't think any of y'all are old enough to remember that, but we had those rations and all of that. Although the worst thing that they introduced, I think, was when they started putting chicory in coffee. And some people still like that today, but they put that a ground up root in coffee to help with that. So again, some people liked it, but it was actually a deception. It was actually, they were, putting something in because they didn't have enough stuff going on. But this is what happens. A quart of wheat is the amount of food that it takes for one person to survive one day. And a denarius is the amount of pay a person got a day. So here was the plan. If you want to eat for one day, you got to work for one day. Well, what if you got a family of 5, 6, 7, 8? Somebody's going to starve. Because there's not enough days in the week and there's not enough hours in the day for you to work to pay to feed everybody. And then you become Les Miserables. You start stealing bread, and again, you got all this other stuff. You'd like somebody from Ware Shoals knows Les Miserables. That's impressive to me. I don't know if it is to you. 3 quarts of barley. Here's the thing that gets missed a lot, because we eat barley today. I don't know why, but we do. Some people, my grandma used to put it in soup, and I was like, what's these little things bubbling around in the soup? I actually have some at home in the cabinet. I don't know why. I just bought it because it was $1 and something, and I said, yeah, this reminds me of my grandmother. But anyway, barley was not human food back then. Barley was considered animal food. So this simply means that humans will be reduced to eating animal food. Today, listen, bugs, cockroach milk. Can you imagine that? It was on the news. I was glad that nobody on the news on the morning, on the Today Show wanted to drink it the other day when they were talking about it. Seaweed, soy, meat alternatives, and lab-grown imitation meat. I don't get near it. It might get up and walk to me. I don't want anything like that. That's too Frankenstein-y to me. But it's being introduced under the guise of some very broad-minded, globalist kind of things. Global warming, climate change, environmental awareness. But the question is this sensitization? I don't know, and I'm not saying it is. I'm not being conspiracy theorist. But is this sensitizing people now with imitation meat and eating bugs and whatnot to a point later? There's a great episode, here again, my old TV shows. There's a great episode of Good Times. And you remember the elderly lady down the hall, they took her in and fed her because they were afraid she had been eating dog food. But she brought meatloaf to the meal. And they didn't want to eat. They asked JJ to pray, and he said, the Lord is my German Shepherd, and the whole thing. And let's see, I have a memory like that, I'm sorry. But it turns out she didn't feed them. She said, I eat it myself, but I wouldn't feed it to my friends. But it was a social commentary. This is how bad things, were in certain times and places in the United States. But it's where we could be headed again. Do not harm the oil in the wine. Seems like a strange thing to say, but oil is needed to make bread, and wine is needed also for cooking and for purifying water. So basically, these are luxuries that have to be protected. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice say, "Come or proceed." And a pale horse, its rider was Death, and Hades followed him. They were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and famine and pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. The pale horse, the word is chloros, where we get the word chlorophyll. It means pale, ashen green pallor. It's the color of a corpse. Death and hell, death and Hades. Death is the state of existence, and Hades was the place of existence. So basically, there was nothing good when this rider came. You were going to die. Death and Hades, the place of the dead. You were going to, another way to say that could be the grave. You were going to be dead and buried. A fourth of the world's population would be 2 billion people dying today. That is roughly the entire populations of Africa and North America combined. Think about the prospect of waking up, well, we wouldn't. Think of the prospect if you were British and you woke up in somewhere in Britain, Glastonbury, tomorrow, and the BBC said nobody's left in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, or Africa. They're gone. They're dead. I mean, it's unconscionable. You can't fathom that. But the scriptures say he would have authority to kill a fourth of the earth's population. That would have been a far smaller number than it is today. But the number today is unbelievable. By the way, do you realize how big the population is in India? China has 1.43 billion people. And India has 1.39 billion people. And it's a much smaller place. I just cannot imagine that number of people. But nonetheless, 2 billion people. So this is the natural progression. God's judgment is severe. First, those who have rejected him, and those who have refused to believe, those who have refused to be faithful, those who are easily deceived, have a weak faith or no faith at all, will be suckered in by the rider of the white horse. And he will deceive, because he is the son of Satan, in a sense, and Satan is a liar and the father of lies. And so his only goal is to lie and deceive. And so these people will be deceived, and they will be sucked in, and this great dictator and world system will come to power, and he will have control. He will not have to fire one bullet, apparently, to gain control. He will be given control. We will give it to him. But then after that, some will open their eyes and see that we've been deceived, and there will be war, and this war will lead to famine, and this famine will lead to death. And God will have begun his righteous judgment on the world. This is not the end, though. It only really gets worse, but this is bad enough. But this is all the time we have for tonight. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts? Any comments?
I know so little about Revelation. I've read it, but didn't understand anything I read. Is this the tribulation?
This, yes, this could be considered part of the tribulation, yes. We'll bring that up next week. There are several things that we might need to spend a little time on next week, because they all kind of play into this chapter, these chapters coming in. The rapture, the millennium, the tribulation, those kind of things. So we may kind of go over here and dock the ship for a little bit and talk about those things and how they play in. Next Wednesday we will have our church's charge conference at 7:30. It'll be in the fellowship hall. So no, we're in the fellowship hall. Where will it be? It will be in the sanctuary. We're in the fellowship hall. So at 7:30 next week, I will have to, cut it off and go down for the annual meeting. But we will still meet next week. We will have our time, and we'll do what we can, and we'll move on with it. And as I said Sunday, I will be preaching this series of sermons that really Revelation has inspired me about what the church should be and what Christians should be. And I began, the topic Sunday is be alert, and it's taken from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. Be alert, for your enemy, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion. And so we'll do that, because everything that's picked out that I've been led to put down is something that individual Christians and the Christians as the church together need to be about as we do this thing called Christianity together. So I hope you'll be a part of it. Thanks, everybody.